Hi, everybody. For today's episode, I have a video excerpt for you from my Layer of the Alchemist Spotify podcast. You've heard me talk about the podcast here on the channel before. It acts as a companion piece to my YouTube channel. I take some of the topics I talk about here, and on the podcast, I expand on them as well as play full-length songs. So for this episode of the podcast, I had a special guest join me. Heavy metal and hard rock author, journalist, and critic Martin Popoff came onto the podcast, and he talked with me about his 5 only influential new wave of British heavy metal bands. It was a fascinating discussion. You're going to see a little excerpt from it here at the beginning of the podcast here, us talking about the new wave of British heavy metal as well as his first pick. So if you enjoy this, head on over to Spotify, look for Layer of the Alchemist. I'll also put a link in the description down below for the show. Make sure you follow it. You'll hear the rest of our discussions, Martin's other picks, and you'll hear the songs that we play for each one of the bands that he picked. All right? Okay, so thanks a lot. Until we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal. There were a ton of bands in this scene. Why did it come down to only 5 for you as having any kind of major influence?
Yeah, I mean, I've often, talked and debated with people and argued with people about the meaning of this word influence, or the various levels of meaning of the word influence. But there's also the word inspiration, and these overlap somewhat, but you could be strict about it or loose about it. I feel there's a lot of inspiration from the new wave of British heavy metal. I think there's a general importance that arose out of it based on, maybe we can get into this a little later, but I'll just say it in a short general sense, in the igniting in interest and inflaming as a hobby those who love heavy metal, particularly people like a Brian Slagle or a Lars Ulrich or a lot of these journalists over in LA. Brian was working at Oz Records, so he's importing all this stuff. So, if you want to look at the broad movements of heavy metal history, I did an episode of my podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, called How Lars Ulrich Invented Hair Metal. and the whole idea of that is that the new wave of British heavy metal started a metal community in LA, which turned into those early Metal Blade samplers, a general excitement around heavy metal and a profusion of a bunch of heavy metal. And then you got a hair metal scene, which in the early days was not much different than new wave of British heavy metal music, and a thrash scene starting at once. So to net it out, the big importance of the new wave of British heavy metal is it started a huge heavy metal scene of all types, starting in around 1983 in LA and San Francisco, and going all the way up to about 1992. So essentially, the new wave of British heavy metal, as we're going to talk about, maybe there's not so much direct influence by a lot of these bands. There's a huge influence of the genre on its own, or inspiration rather than influence, that causes a massive multi-platinum industry that just swings unabated from 1983 all the way up to about 1992.
Yeah, and it does start with the new wave of British heavy metal, and it's interesting for me. It's sort of the first time where bands are coming out and they're completely embracing the metal term, the metal. We are heavy metal. When you go back to the 70s, Ritchie Blackmore didn't consider Rainbow to be a metal band, really. Priest, maybe to a certain degree. Sabbath never really called themselves heavy metal. You had a bunch of bands that were very influential on the new wave of British heavy metal, these early bands like Zeppelin and Deep Purple, but they kind of didn't really consider themselves heavy metal. They didn't fully 100% embrace that. Even Motorhead never totally embraced that. But when these new crop of new wave of British heavy metal bands are coming out, they're right from the beginning coming out and, all right, this is heavy metal. They're embracing this concept of heavy metal and they're running with it.
Yeah, that's all part of the thing. part of the many reasons why, you can look at it as a genre and a little, pumping steam engine of heavy metal, of an industry. And that starts with the likes of Judas Priest starting, getting the leather and studs and, the front cover of Unleashed in the East, and anthems late 78, like Take on the World, Hellbent for Leather. So you get these codified anthems of being proud about being heavy metal, not particularly using the term heavy metal immediately, but then you get Saxon coming in with the likes of, the album cover of the first album, Wheels of Steel, and then you get their proud to be heavy metal anthems. And you get, everybody's got logos and sword and sorcery all over the place. And you get Eddie on the first Iron Maiden, and you get, the knight on the horse on the Metal for Mothers, the first Metal for Mothers. So you get album covers that are truly heavy metal, and you know what you're going to get. And you get song titles and band names and logos, and they're all dressing this way, somewhat influenced by punk fashion in terms of at least, the leather jackets and things like that. But essentially, and Motorhead, I guess, is also a good start for this as well. They looked pretty darn new wave of British heavy metal right away, and there's always a huge debate whether Motorhead's even a new wave of British heavy metal band at all. But yeah, you get this sort of what's on the tin you're going to get on the inside, because in the old days, I often say that Black Sabbath looked just like the Doobie Brothers. They all looked the same. The Eagles, everybody looked the same. They dressed like 70s versions of hippies with their big handlebar mustaches and stuff, and their slightly hippie clothes. Nobody was looking particularly heavy metal. And as you said, the aesthetic of their music and even the way they spoke about their music, plus the album covers front and back and the song titles and all that, it just wasn't so obviously heavy metal in the 70s. It's almost like these bands just had a predilection to play this kind of music, and they did it more often. More songs per album were like that, and hence we called them heavy metal bands. But it really starts in 1980.
Yeah, well, you just mentioned them a moment ago, and the first choice here on your list is Motorhead. So tell us what you feel their importance and influence was on the new wave of British heavy metal. All right, there you go. A quick little excerpt from the podcast. Make sure you head over to Spotify to listen to the rest of the episode, to hear what Martin has to say about Motorhead and the other bands that he picked for his 5 only influential new wave of British heavy metal bands, as well as the songs that we chose for each one of those bands. All right? Okay, thanks, and we'll see you again soon.